On behalf of the Federated Department of History at Rutgers University-Newark and the New Jersey Institute of Technology, a very warm welcome to Teaching Empire, a talk by Elisabeth Eittreim. Before we begin, a few brief notes. This event is being recorded for our archive and will be made available on our YouTube channel. I will post the link in the chat and hope you will subscribe and follow our social media accounts to learn more about our faculty, courses, and events of interest. Closed captioning is enabled. To view, please click on the closed caption or CC button at the bottom of your screen to display subtitles or view a full transcript. To ensure the comfort of everyone participating today, chat messages are only visible to speakers, but we look forward to your questions and comments. So please enter any questions in the Q&A box as they come up, and we will answer as many live as time allows. Our format for tonight: Elisabeth will give a presentation about her work, followed by facilitated discussion by Elisabeth Eittreim. With that, let's meet our wonderful speakers. Elisabeth Eittreim received her PhD in history from Rutgers, New Brunswick. She holds a Master of Arts in Human Rights from Columbia University, a Master of Arts in Teaching from Quinnipiac University, and a Bachelor of Arts in History from the University of Virginia. An award-winning scholar teacher, she is currently a lecturer here at Rutgers-Newark and teaches very popular courses on U.S. history, U.S. women's history, and human rights history. She also teaches women's and gender studies at Georgian Court University. Committed to social justice advocacy, she maintains a blog, and of particular interest may be her piece on COVID-19 and Native Americans. I'm going to put that link in the chat. She's also written stories for Huffington Post on Charlottesville violence. And also, This Is Not Normal, 2 decades after Columbine. In her free time, she serves as Board of Education President in Atlantic Highlands. Now, the focus of tonight is her book, Teaching Empire, Native Americans, Filipinos, and U.S. Imperial Education from 1879 to 1918. Teaching Empire will reveal the challenges that American teachers faced as they worked to translate U.S. imperial policy into practice around the turn of the 20th century. We'll be hearing more about that in just a few minutes. Our moderator, Elisabeth Eittreim, is an alum of our Federated History program, currently an assistant principal at Summit High School, graduated from Boston College and received her MAT from Rutgers-Newark. She holds a Master of Education from King in Education Administration. She's taught high school history at Asbury Park High School and Summit High School. And a self-described massive history nerd, she completed her doctoral coursework here in American Studies and then left to pursue her administration path, serving as assistant principal and principal at Columbia High School up until 2019. You can catch her teaching the seminar in teaching history this summer here at Rutgers-Newark. She's also worked on teacher education and leadership programs at the Newark Museum for the National Endowment for the Humanities and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, a member of teacher education policy and advisory committees at Montclair State and William Patterson Universities. She has never exited a bookstore empty-handed. And with that, thank you both so much for being here. Dr. Eittreim, the virtual floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much, Christina, and of course to the whole Newark History Department for inviting me to talk about the book. And many thanks, of course, to Elisabeth Eittreim as well for moderating the talk tonight. And thanks to those of you who are in attendance this evening. I can't see you, but I know you're there. I'd like to share some slides during the talk tonight. And the first slide is an overview of today's talk. So next slide, please. In today's talk, first I will set the scene, providing some background information. Then I'll review the sources before moving on to chapter highlights and wrapping up to discuss legacies and implications of imperial education and why this matters. Next slide, please. So who, when, and where is this book about? Something that I like to do as a teacher and a scholar is to identify the who, what, when, where, why, and how of a book or a source. And if you can do that, you can have a good sense of its meaning or its intent. So specifically, Teaching Empire focuses on American teachers hired by the US government to assimilate Native Americans and Filipinos to dominant American cultural norms around the turn of the 20th century. This was an effort to, quote, civilize and pacify these colonial subjects, to acculturate Native Americans and Filipinos to white middle-class Protestant norms. As a comparative study, I focus on the years 1879 to 1918, the same years that the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania was open, and I use Carlisle as the framework for better understanding teachers' participation in educating Native youth as part of this broader experiment of American imperial education. The vast majority of teachers who worked at Carlisle were white, Protestant, unmarried or widowed women, many of whom were committed to the idea of saving Indians from themselves. In addition, there were a handful of Native teachers who worked at Carlisle as well. Next slide, please. In the case of the Philippines, the US government began sending young, single, mostly white American men and women teachers to the islands beginning in 1901, shortly after the end of the War of 1898, when the US had received the islands as a bounty of war. Many of the American teachers sent to the Philippines were recent college graduates who had taken a civil service exam and were recommended or tapped by university leaders. The largest group, more than 500 Americans, arrived in the Philippines in August 1901 aboard the USS Thomas, and you can imagine the spectacle this created. Thereafter, all American teachers sent to the islands became known as Thomasites. The US government hired more men than women, believing men to be better equipped to adapt to the so-called rugged lifestyle of living in the islands. And overall, the Thomasites broadly saw themselves as part of something larger. So that covers, broadly speaking, the who, the when, and the where of the book. The more complex questions are, of course, the what, why, and how. What is the book about? Why does it matter? And how do I prove this? Next slide, please. As I write in the book, although not organized as part of official military operations, the Carlisle and Philippines projects were authorized by the US Department of War and sought to take over where soldiers left off. In the 19th century American West, US soldiers decimated Indian peoples and lands, forcing them onto reservations before the Indian Wars moved into classrooms. In the Philippines, US soldiers suppressed Filipino resistance as teachers established schools to quell unrest and disseminate American culture, again shifting the war for people's hearts and minds into the schoolhouse. All of this is to say that these projects of imperial education largely emerged out of conflict, but were billed as part of being more civilized. Still, the goal of upholding American domination or rule remained, and the definition of what should be considered, quote, civilized or not, was revealed. As I've already suggested, the book is broadly about US empire and how education was used as a tool to dominate, pacify, and acculturate Native Americans and Filipinos to white middle-class Protestant American norms. But more than this, the book is substantively about the everyday experiences of these Carlisle teachers and Thomasites. It's about the everyday work of empire building, which reveals the intimacy and fragility of building American empire, schoolhouse by schoolhouse, classroom by classroom. Next slide, please. While intimacy is evident in part by the closeness of teacher-student interactions and the building of empire classroom by classroom, I'll quickly outline how the fragility of this mission became evident to me through research that I found. Next slide, please, I think, or yes, that's it, thanks. The next, go one prior, Christina, sorry, perfect, thank you. I found that one, students and communities' resistance to Western education challenged the foundation of each mission. At Carlisle, for example, with student runaways, and in the Philippines with low school attendance. Two, the fragility of building empire also resulted from a relative lack of resources and support given to teachers, short on school supplies, high on round-the-clock work schedules, as well as teachers in the Philippines feeling isolated or unsupported. And three, the fragility of empire building also stemmed from things that were well beyond the scope of the everyday classroom. In both cases, the onslaught of disease, sexual scandal or improprieties, and in the case of Carlisle, assumed financial mismanagement in later years, and in the Philippines, warfare and environmental disaster. So you can imagine that with these and other complications, that the mission of teaching empire was not on firm footing, not as robust as the US government would have liked people to believe. Next slide, please. Largely, this book is about the teachers, most of whom bought into the mission of the need to uplift the Indian or the Filipino, to save peoples whom they thought were otherwise bent toward extinction or uncivilized and unfit for self-government. A few teachers came to appreciate or respect certain elements of Native American or Filipino culture, and still others saw their work as a job, a paycheck, a way to support family members back home. The book is also about the resistance and resilience of the students, their families, their communities, and nations. Though I wish I had done more to uncover these stories, perhaps that is my next project. This book is about race, gender, and empire, the racialized and gendered assumptions of the turn of the 20th century United States, the white supremacist and patriarchal norms that were so mainstreamed that they were somewhat invisible to the so-called insiders, though certainly threatening and in some ways quite devastating for so-called outsiders. My goal with the book is not to make heroes or villains out of these teachers, but to strive to better understand their motivations and experiences within the context of the time period. As a historian, I look to the past to better understand the present, and this story helps me to understand how people in the past sought to use education as a means of promoting US power and a particular worldview, how teachers were agents in their own right, and how today we still need to work towards using and defining education in a way that hears and reflects multiple perspectives and promotes justice, equity, and understanding. As I argue in the book, teachers' promotion of the dominant culture within and beyond their classrooms furthered US imperial ambitions, disseminating ideals regarding the righteousness of white middle-class ideals, even as some students and communities rejected such teachings. As mediators, teachers profoundly shaped the experiences of their students as they translated government policies on the ground and helped to build an empire, however fragile, sometimes transforming themselves in the process. In shifting to answer the question of how do I prove this, I want to turn briefly to the primary sources that I used. So, next slide, please. When beginning this project, I had hoped to find personal papers, diaries, letters, and I did. I began with the Carlisle case study and I found correspondence and other documents in the papers of the school's founder and first superintendent. I also sifted through Carlisle school newspapers, government documents, and found the personnel records of teachers to be particularly helpful. In fact, the personnel records for teachers in the Philippine service were also critically important in my research. And even more helpful in the case of the Philippines were the diaries, letters home, and memoirs, preserved in part because, as I said earlier, the Thomasites saw themselves as part of something larger. All in all, I weaved the stories together of 55 teachers and 55 teachers from Carlisle and 33 teachers in the Philippines. And of these, 5 teachers worked both at Carlisle and in the Philippine service. Next slide, please. And that brings me to some chapter highlights. Regarding the introduction, I have already talked about the ways in which these 2 cases show how the US education mission was both an intimate yet fragile endeavor, so we'll move on to chapter 1, the journey to teach. This is a story of how teachers literally made their way to Carlisle and the Philippines. It gives background information on Carlisle's founding, how its first teachers were hired, how bureaucracy grew and hiring methods changed, and discusses what inspired teachers to join the Carlisle mission. Next slide, please. For example, as noted on this slide, on October 21st, 1879, soon-to-be Carlisle teacher Mariana Burgess wrote the following to the school superintendent, quote, "Thousands of people are looking with anxious expectancy to see whether Carlisle proves a success or a failure. I have been a teacher among the Pawnee Indians and very well know the many insurmountable obstacles to meet in attempting to educate Indian children, and can readily see the great advantage of having them removed from the tribe. The object of this letter is to inquire whether I can be of any service to you as a teacher." Mariana Burgess was hired and remained a powerful figure at the school for 25 years. Next slide, please. In the case of the Philippines, chapter 1 explains how the Philippine service came about, and then delves into teachers' stories, following them as they moved westward, largely by railroad, meeting one another along the way, and then across the Pacific, building relationships and camaraderie aboard US vessels, including the USS Thomas. As shown in this slide, Thomasite Mary Fee remembered in her summer 1901 arrival in the Philippines this way: "I was going to see the world, and I was one of an army of enthusiasts enlisted to instruct our little brown brother and to pass the torch of Occidental knowledge several degrees east of the international dateline." End quote. Fee remained in the islands longer than most Thomasites, many of whom struggled to stay as long as their 3-year contract stipulated. Next slide, please. Chapter 2, Life at Carlisle. This chapter reveals the round-the-clock expectations of being on duty as a teacher, the toll this took, and the strength and commitment some had. It discusses teachers' involvement in recruiting students to fill classrooms, as well as their work aimed at culturally transforming Native youth. As evident in this slide, the following quote from a Carlisle school newspaper dated March 2nd, 1900, reflects how explicit the white supremacist ideology was that guided the work at the Indian boarding school. Quote, "There is only one way to bring the Indian up to the superior race, and that is to give him all the advantages of the superior race in the midst of the people of the superior race." Clearly, no words were minced here. The article assumed that its readership of students, staff, and reformers would or should be sympathetic to such ideas, since the fundamental mission of Carlisle to save Indians through complete assimilation into white culture was never hidden, but rather proudly celebrated. The chapter also discusses the physical transformation of youth, the cutting of hair and changing of dress, as well as the rules and curriculum, the strict school day schedule, English-only instruction, separation of boys and girls, and it chronicles how school personnel took on parental roles and responsibilities, caring for the sick, scolding misbehavior, offering advice and, quote, moral guidance regarding abstinence or religious devotion. Next slide, please. Chapter 3. Chapter 3 focuses on discipline at the boarding school, from a teacher ordering a student to sit in a corner or scrub the floor, to corporal punishment or lockup in isolation. There was also a culture of self-discipline expected of students, and Chapter 3 investigates the role that teachers played in reinforcing, or in rare cases, undermining such school discipline. It also discusses outbreaks of disease, some of which resulted in student deaths. In addition, the chapter examines the structures that controlled teachers' everyday lives and how teachers exhibited agency at times, speaking out against what they viewed to be corrupt administrations, including a case of sexual misconduct and another of apparent financial mismanagement. Next slide, please. Chapter 4, Life and Death on the Islands. This was probably my favorite chapter to write because the personal records preserved by the Thomasites were so rich, leading me to be able to better understand their experiences, and I was even more surprised or shocked by the findings here than those of Carlisle. Regarding life on the islands, this part of the chapter discusses teachers' arduous journeys to remote teaching posts and how they establish schools. It discusses their adaptations and resistance to Filipino cultural norms, including several teachers who expressed white supremacist perspectives in their personal writings. Unlike the camaraderie teachers built when journeying to the islands, many Thomasites felt isolated as they were sometimes the only or one of a few Americans living in a remote outpost. The chapter also chronicles teachers' work and leisure time, the latter of which included hunting, dancing, and for some, somewhat controversial sexual relationships with Filipinos. Regarding death on the islands, it is essential to understand that teachers entered a literal war zone. Some picked up arms to defend themselves or their adoptive communities. A stunning case is that of Glenn Evans, who noted in an August 1st, 1904 journal entry that 27 Filipinos had been killed by insurgents a week earlier in a nearby town. Over the next several months, he reported participating in fighting, capturing, and sometimes killing men, women, and children. In one such incident on October 1st, 1904, he wrote that he and a friend saw a boat with 5 people approaching them. He loaded his Winchester shotgun, the people in the boat jumped overboard, and he claimed, quote, "We opened up on them and got them all, 2 boys, 3 men," end quote. While the US military had been ordered to kill boys as young as age 10, teachers were not soldiers. Evans lasted less than a year at his post, perhaps traumatized by the violence of his surroundings and the practical abandonment of US education authorities. Many other teachers heard or were directly impacted by ongoing military battles. At least a few even witnessed the devastation wrought by torture. Others recorded and tended to outbreaks of disease. Ultimately, Thomasites served as more than simply teachers. They were missionaries, nurses, translators, architects, builders, sanitary workers, cargo inspectors, de facto soldiers, etc. Their mission was all-encompassing, particularly when military conflict, disease, or environmental disaster disrupted regular life. Overall, some Thomasites adapted, some thrived, and some couldn't wait to return home. Next slide, please. And that brings us to Chapter 5, which chronicles teachers' lives and reflections after their service at Carlisle or in the Philippines. It opens by focusing on the 5 educators who worked at both locations and recounts their experiences in shifting from one to the other. Not surprisingly, these individuals were quite committed to teaching both Native and Filipino youth, with some referring to their professional endeavors as their life's work. Chapter 5 reveals that the majority of Carlisle teachers continued to work in the field of education after leaving the boarding school, and those who worked at Carlisle in its earliest years showed a particular devotion to what they later reflected on as the Carlisle spirit. Mariana Burgess, discussed earlier, was one of the most committed teachers to Carlisle's mission. She and others were sustained in part by strong friendships with fellow teachers, as well as their deep devotion to Indian uplift. Yet other teachers were burdened by this work. They burned out physically and mentally and moved on. Regarding the Philippines, a handful of Thomasites remained in the islands for decades, many sustained by marriage to fellow Americans. Some Thomasites remained overseas in other locations, teaching, writing, volunteering. Still others sought higher degrees and became academics or pursued vocations including business or the ministry. And I end the chapter this way: regardless of the extent to which teachers intentionally promoted imperial education or empowered Indigenous students, they in turn navigated and reproduced the systems that sought to indoctrinate Indian and Filipino subjects to follow, quote, civilized American mores. Purposefully or not, they normalized white supremacist ideas at the expense of Indigenous autonomy, even as a few individuals sought to preserve what they saw as the, quote, good in the Indian or Filipino cultures. Ultimately, the extent to which teachers' behaviors or written reflections exhibited their own attainment of being civilized is debatable, and their actions, benevolent or not, reinforce power at the center of empire rather than the periphery. Next slide, please. And this is how I'll wrap up. I argue that to view the Filipino and Indian education experiments as simply being forced upon unwilling participants is an oversimplification, as Native American and Filipino peoples saw some benefits that such schooling might offer, but also struggled to maintain certain autonomy. Both at Carlisle and in the Philippines, structural inequities shaped students' and teachers' experiences. Some power imbalances often advantaged teachers whose cultural assumptions and prejudices reinforced their commitment to the work, even as they faced challenges. Moreover, teaching empire arose not as a choice regarding whether Western education was benevolent or just, but rather, having already bought into its perceived promise, it became a method of effectively transferring such knowledge and ideology in the face of sometimes almost impossible circumstances on the ground. In many ways, Indian and Philippine service teachers transformed Indigenous cultures and structures. They introduced new ways of living and communicating, disrupting familial and social norms, and put into place a school system that represented US power, sometimes inflaming anti-US sentiments in the populations they came to serve. Ultimately, it was teachers who implemented, negotiated, and mediated US government education policies with Native Americans and Filipinos, helping to make meaning of these imperial experiments and ambitions. Some other legacies. In the case of Carlisle, Indian schools continue to exist today, although their missions have profoundly changed for the better. For example, by encouraging parental participation, promoting children's social and emotional well-being, and embracing cultural difference. Other legacies, of course, include the continued under-resourcing of Native communities and institutions today, perhaps evidenced most recently by the profound devastation wrought by COVID among Native peoples. Regarding the Philippines, the framework put into place by Thomasites is the basis for the public school system still in place today. In 2001, there was a centennial celebration of the Thomasites' work, a celebration that, not surprisingly, silenced the trauma imposed and endured by Thomasites themselves. I end the book pointing to what sociologist Julian Go noted in 2011, when he argued that, quote, falling empires, like rising ones, do not behave well, end quote. I argue that turn of the 20th century efforts to implement imperial education illustrate how such a rising empire did not behave well. Shifting to today, I then point to the family separation policies implemented at the US southern border in 2018 as potential evidence of American empire in decline, and I make parallels to earlier cases of family separation, such as that embodied by Carlisle and other Indian boarding schools. I suggest that the recent case of family separation echoed the separation of Indigenous families of more than a century before. But I note a difference as well, and I'll end with this. While everyday folks around the turn of the 20th century largely bought into and drove the nation's imperial desires, in 2018, a critical mass of Americans resisted family separation that had been declared necessary on their behalf, giving at least a modicum of hope for the most vulnerable and for the nation. Thank you.
So thank you, Christina. I'll go ahead and dive right in. Elisabeth, thank you so much for that talk. I'm actually struck by the teacher who described herself as a member of an army of enthusiasts, and the way in which George Evans literally becomes an actor in a war. And I suppose we should start with, I think, what is the most difficult throughout the book, which is the trauma and the violence that is visited upon many of the Filipinos and students at the Carlisle school by teachers. And you and I, as both teachers, feel that. I think you and your research and me in reading the book. So I'd be really glad to kind of start with you talking a little bit about what it was like to read those sources and think about the work that we do as teachers and the work that you were reading about teachers doing.
Okay, thank you for the question. Yes, well, I am a teacher. I started my career as a middle school teacher out of college. And I've always been interested in teaching, so even when I joined academia, I still ended up focusing on teaching. And so that's what I wanted to research and learn about, and learn about what the experiences and motivations of these teachers are. So I came to find these two different case studies and talk about them. And reading, especially in the case of the Philippines, because it is so explicit, right? The violence that they're experiencing. I didn't talk about it in the talk, but in their diaries, many of them write day after day of the number of people dying of various diseases in their town, or not knowing what, and smallpox and all kinds of things, and not knowing what to do, and being afraid to write to their families home, right? So they're also suffering from other kinds of violence themselves. And the closeness that the war is, I was not expecting that. I did know, of course, the history of the region, just based on secondary research before, getting into the archives. But I didn't anticipate that, Glenn Evans, for example, or others, there are others in the book that I found, would pick up guns, right? And not only to defend themselves, but others also talk about the violence of killing, or the wanting to kill, even if they don't, or the imagining of killing. And in that piece, the one that I shared in the talk with Glenn Evans, the poor guy, he actually followed his older brother to the Philippines, who had a very positive experience. And he left within a year. I mean, he just had a horrific experience. And I would be curious, because the scope of the book is pretty large, with the 55 and 33 teachers, 55 Carlisle and 33 Thomasites. I only follow each person so far, and of course there's some sort of stars that rise to the top in the book that are talked about a bit more than others. But it's fascinating, all of the stories they have, and I would have loved to follow them all in as much depth as possible. But.
Right. We talked a little bit about the chart and the statistic at Carlisle of the students who died, and that being something that was part of those teachers' experiences. And could you share a little bit more of the way in which you thought about how you would talk about the work that teachers did? You shared some things about how your committee advised you to look at that. And I know that in this Zoom, without being able to see who's with us, we can safely assume, I think, at a book talk at Rutgers-Newark, that some of our historian colleagues are in the audience, some grad students are in the audience. I'm hopeful that some undergrad and maybe some high school students are in the audience. People starting to think about what a master's thesis might be, or some doctoral research might be, and how you kind of conceived of what the questions might be, and how some committee members and mentors to you suggested you go about starting to dig. Okay. It's such a difficult potential topic.
Right. So one of the scholars serving on my dissertation committee is a Native American historian. And so this is her field of expertise. And she had, after reading, I think after one of our initial conversations, she said to me, this sounds interesting, etc. Be careful about villainizing the teachers, right? Be careful about not being too one-sided. And so having, you know, I was very conscious of that when I went into the archives and when I was looking through things. And so when you ask about the student deaths, one thing that stood out to me is there are a series of letters from the teachers to the school superintendent at Carlisle, saying how devastated they are by the loss of students, especially when the school opens. There are several letters about this, and the mourning and the funerals and what they did and how they felt it, right? Or at least they say that. So I tried to, when I went into the archives, I tried, you know, I wasn't going, as I said in the talk, I wasn't trying to villainize or make heroes of anyone. I really just wanted to understand what their experiences were like, and tried to put it into a proper historical context. So I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you. There are stories. Can you talk a little bit about the five? Because we talked about the way when we were preparing to do this today, what a kind of comparative study can be, and what your book is and is not with regard to kind of attempting to draw comparisons and parallels. And that'll lead us to talk about some other parallels that I think readers do naturally draw historically and then kind of current that you talked about. But the how to decide how to talk about the two places individually, and then how to talk about the two places in relation and conversation to each other.
Okay, thanks. Yes, so one moment that in the archives, actually the first archive I went to was the Cumberland County Historical Society in Pennsylvania. And, you know, I was very eager, I had a big mission. And when I went to the archives, I only, you know, had funding or whatever to go for a week or a few days here and there. And so I would go and I would take pictures and pictures and pictures of everything. And now, of course, a lot of it's already online, which is nice, for at least for Carlisle. But and then I came back and I would uncover it. But for this one day, I was on microfilm, that's how old I am, on microfilm, going through the Carlisle student newspapers. And I see that this teacher, Clara Donaldson, had just arrived from the Philippines at Carlisle. And while my advisor, so I was so excited, I get in touch with my advisor saying, this is real, my comparison is legitimate. And she of course says, well, of course it's legitimate. I wouldn't have let you move forward if it hadn't been legitimate. And I was like, oh, right. But in my head, it was very reassuring to see that there actually were teachers, that these two, the Indian service, in particular Carlisle, and the Philippine service were comparable, or there was some kind of precedent with one moving into the other. And that's what I learned as I moved through the research. And, you know, then I ended up finding several other teachers who made that similar transition, all of them from the Philippines to Carlisle. In fact, although some of them had started elsewhere in the Indian service, went back and forth. But so I think, and then in terms of structuring the chapters, what I did was I went through, you know, as many sources, all the photographs that I took of the archive material, and I just looked for themes, right? And so, you know, death and violence just blew up, and other things, and that's kind of how the structure of the chapters came to be. I didn't have a grand plan that I went in with. You know, I'm sure I had some kind of plan, but then it was really grew up from what I found.
What are some things that you wound up starting to pursue and then did not pursue? And what were some things besides, for example, starting to discover those five, that you either struggled with the most while working with them, or just chose to not work on completely?
So with the five, things that, you know, it's interesting. So there's a couple that comes essentially from the Philippines to Carlisle. And then afterwards, after Carlisle, they continue work among Native American communities in the American Southwest. And they sort of proclaim to be, in their own writing, you know, a real advocate of the Indian and that kind of thing. But in reading through what they're writing, from a 21st century lens, it's very demeaning, right? They're going to pick and choose, for example, what they're going to help the Indian by letting, with their own lens, picking what they think is best, and then sort of trying to get away, have the native peoples abandon whatever other kind of, traditions they have. And so I just tried to present it as it was. In writing about it, I think it helped, or it may not have helped, but it impacted how I approached the topic, having been a teacher, even though, it was a century plus later.
Right.
But I just approached, I was really trying to find out what was their mission, what was their motivation throughout, what sustained them. And with these 5 teachers, they all have different stories, but I thought that was a nice way, because I sort of talk about them in the beginning, I talk about them in the end. It's kind of a book ending,
And some of those things were very, I think, kind of practical things that are still motivating to teachers, including there's one who takes a job because it is higher paying, literally. People
Right.
are talking about where they want to live, or what's a place to live that's good for them, whether they believe in it. And then when they start to not believe in it, deciding to not work for people doing things they no longer believe in, or thinking that work might be doing harm, and literally choosing to step away from it. And certainly I think for teachers who might be in the audience with us, realizing what else it is that teachers mitigate or mediate in the classroom, although this is a very particular violent and trauma-based work in some instances. We find ourselves in classrooms mitigating all kinds of things, and attempting often to limit damage that we may be finding done to our students in schools or outside the classrooms, outside our doors. That I think that was very much something that I took away from it as a teacher.
Well, may I say something quick? There was one teacher at Carlisle who, she worked there towards the end. Verna Dunnigan was her name, and she, she says in her writing that she's not going to enforce the English only policy, right? So Native children have their own languages, then they're forced to abandon them. And she talks about the cruelty of that. And so there were, so she knew what was happening. She just kind of didn't intervene, because although she had work to do, she was hired to do a certain job. As you said, that's what they're doing on an everyday, day-to-day. That's what this intimate work is about. And that's what makes the empire, fragile, in my argument, is because you have these people, you're depending on so many people, and they're, they're doing what they have to do to do their best work, and to get through and pay the bills.
Right. It certainly feels like a precursor to the Peace Corps for some readers, including me as a reader. And it turns out, indeed, it is in some ways. So could you talk a little bit more about that? And I imagine that your background in human rights also might have informed the way you approached that part of the research.
Yes, thank you. So there are other scholars who do talk about this quite directly, and write books about how the Talmusites going to the Philippines, that was the first experiment in peace building, in the Peace Corps, and sort of sending democracy elsewhere, right? And in fact, and then there are other scholars that make comparisons between, or point to the Indian service as being a precursor to the Philippine service, which preceded the Peace Corps. So I think this idea of, American exceptionalism, basically, right? Americans thinking that we do everything the best, America's great, we're perfect, blah, blah, blah. And wanting, and we are great. I'm not saying that there aren't wonderful values that this country holds, but we're not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. So I think that's kind of what the teachers are mediating, and in designing these programs, you might have something on paper saying we're going, and you sign up all these idealist people who say, I want to go abroad and help and do this, and then they get on the ground, and what they experience on a day-to-day basis is very different, right? And so I think that's in many ways what happened even in the Indian service and in Carlisle as well. So
and so what do we learn about ourselves and teaching and teachers?
Right. So, I mean, so good question. We learn that we have to listen, right? We don't have all the answers. You know, it's sort of the Paulo Freire, however you say his name, of the
Yeah.
pouring in, right, knowledge. And it's we need to not do that. We need not to assume that we have all the answers. You know, I don't want to go the full relativist route. So when you ask the human rights, you know, there's a debate in human rights between relativism and you know, intervening, you know, cultural relativism. And I don't suggest that we shouldn't intervene in places. I mean, I think there are things that people can do to help others. So it's not every man for himself, but you can't just go in assuming that you have all the answers, right? I think that's kind of, I mean, it seems obvious, but even in American policy today, it doesn't seem obvious, unfortunately.
Or if sometimes, I suppose, if it seems obvious, it's not necessarily acted upon as if it's obvious.
Right.
And that was one of the words I shared, struck me the most. At one point, you literally used the word ridiculous. And I actually think that that's really, I don't know how deliberate that word was, and if that went through some editing, that sentence, but at one point, you literally suggest that this work in the Philippines was the ridiculousness of what much of the teachers were being asked to kind of live through and experience, and ridiculous not in a way that kind of undercuts the seriousness of the work and of the violence and the trauma, but just the imperialism or the imperial education as a thing.
You're right. Yeah, I mean, it really, is the only word that seemed to describe it. And it was because there's so many uncertain things, so many traumas happening, and the ridiculousness, that quote is, it's actually follows, you know, one teacher is trying to organize a classroom, doesn't have materials or anything, and is adjusting to Filipino norms, including, you know, goats literally walking through the classroom. I mean, and so it just is ridiculous, but in a serious way as well. I mean, it just, you couldn't, and some of the teachers themselves write about that, and they lament that, and they say they wanted to come to do this, but they can't. And I'm trying to reflect that.
Obviously there's a significant religious theme throughout many of the lives of the teachers who are doing work at both Carlisle and in the Philippines. And there is a question in the chat about the role that Carlisle and other boarding schools played in what the comment says is the rise and diffusion of patriotism, i.e. the Native American church. And I wondered if you might talk a little bit about the kind of work that the teachers were doing or feeling with regard to Christianity in their teaching, or in what they perceived or were told their mission was in the two places.
Okay, sure. So in the case of Carlisle, teachers were very upfront about their religious devotion. They held, you know, they had YMCA kind of organizations within the school. They would bring students to church. They had Christmas celebrations, and children would look forward to getting their present. I mean, you know, and so it was very overt, and it was later criticized, but it was quite overt from day one, and it sustained many of the teachers in their daily lives. In the Philippines, it was a much varied experience. Some of the teachers did claim or gained, maybe deepened their religious devotion, Christian, sort of Protestant, both Protestant for the most part. Any teachers, I did find some Catholic teachers who felt that they were ousted and ignored, or not as well accepted, actually, in both locations. But some of the teachers in the Philippines sort of deepened their own religiosity, and then some of them moved on to become ministers themselves, and others they used whatever moral guidance that they had to sort of, some people had never played cards before, they had never danced before, and so those people going to the Philippines and witnessing dancing, or watching their comrades play cards, or deciding whether they should do those kinds of things. You know, there was a quite a different experience in the Philippines based on what people thought, and a lot of judgment between the teachers on that front.
I'm struck by the idea of the connections that were built among the teachers in the two places, in Carlisle itself, in the Philippines itself, and then in the way in which a few of those people overlapped. I'm picturing the image of the boat of Thomasites leaving and people on that boat, right, in that tight enclosed space, seasick or not, kind of developing these relationships and creating this, quote, army of enthusiasts before they get there. And then communicating or not communicating with each other when they're there, then returning, many going back to teaching in other places, and what that kind of means for that network. And I think the word diffusion does come to mind, because what those teachers will bring back with them is their experiences. In the way that I know many Peace Corps volunteers, one of whom is in the audience, but from some that I know personally, that network becomes a very powerful network that stays with you. And teachers, we know that teachers build relationships that far outlast their potential professional relationships, you know, working together in a school. And I'm sure that was in the sources. It's in the book in some ways, but I thought you might talk about that a little bit.
Yes, I mean, that really stands out. And in the Philippines case, in the sources, many of them talk about in their diaries, they're writing, oh, I just met so-and-so, and we're all on our way to the Philippines, and they call themselves the Philippineites, and they have different names for themselves, and they write songs, and they have college songs on the boat, and a lot of camaraderie is built. And then in Carlisle, there are some teachers that knew each other ahead of time that come together, but their relationships with one another is so profound. Mariana Burgess, who I spoke with, she had a friend, Miss Ely, who are both there for over 2 decades. And when Miss Ely dies, you know, after their time at Carlisle, Miss Marian Burgess is just distraught, and she writes to the superintendent about this. But there are many other teachers at Carlisle who talk about these friends, the friendships, right? And of course, other scholars have written about the importance of female friendship in the 19th century and moving into the 20th century. So I sort of build off of that. But these networks are critically important, right, in sustaining their work and in making their lives afterwards meaningful. And even some teachers in the Philippines, one who she and her husband go together and they come back, even though while she's there, she's quite, you know, can't wait to get home. And she thinks back fondly to all of these things, you know, and she writes about reminiscing about her friends and that the relationship.
Right. So Christina, time-wise, this is kind of my last question. I will encourage, if there's something that a participant wants to make sure Elisabeth addresses, please make sure you've dropped it in the chat for us. So if I go back to when I would say I read my first kind of historian's thing, which was in high school history class. That's my first kind of nerd recollection of reading, oh, this is what historians do. And that was about 1985. If I count all of that, all of my undergrad years, all of my grad years, all of my post-grad years, which have just been many, and I've read many books about school and schooling. I've read many books about teaching and learning. I think that this is the first book I have read about teachers in history. And I'm sorry, Elisabeth, I couldn't prep you about this question because I thought of it about 15 minutes ago. I'm in the place working now where I had that first experience reading historians' work as a high school student. This is a book about teachers. So how do you think teachers should use this book in secondary and college classrooms?
Interesting. It is about teachers, and it's funny because some people were saying, "Oh, teachers, that's boring. Don't write about. What are you going to write about teachers for?" I was like, "What? What do you mean?"
Right.
So hopefully the book isn't too terribly boring. But so the question, can you, I'm sorry, I lost my train of
So,
thought.
and actually 2 questions have come up in the chat. So thank you for those that are connected to this. So I kind of thought we should spend a couple of minutes thinking about how teachers might use this in the secondary classroom.
Yeah.
You know, college professors, it's pretty straightforward. They may use the book or a couple chapters, have students do some reading.
Right.
But if you're a high school teacher, you teach about the Philippine-American War, you teach about imperialism, you teach about the late 19th and early 20th centuries. How might this work, and that of the Carlisle boarding school and other Indian schools, which are covered in high school teaching, kind of be brought into the classroom? And then I'll kind of get to those last couple chat questions.
I would always start with the primary sources with teaching, with whether it's high school or college, and have them read the letter, right? Have them read Mariana Burgess's letter to the superintendent asking for the job and her rationale and why she should be hired. Or read, with high school, you'd have to edit what they would be allowed to read, but read some of the language that's in the teacher's diaries, reflecting on things as you're learning about the War of 1898, or as you're learning about, because I think if these things are covered at all, it might be a little box in a textbook, depending on the class. It might be discussed more in depth in a higher level, senior year kind of high school class. But I think it can be useful. I'm hopeful that it sort of breathes life into this time period, this turn of the century. And by going to the sources, that's what I would recommend is, I've got a million footnotes and a lot of the sources are accessible. Or you could I've got little vignettes too that you could piece out.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm giving it to our teachers for tomorrow, basically. There's a great and very specific question about Native American teachers at the Carlisle School. So if you might address that for a couple minutes.
Sure. Yeah. So this is, there were, in my, research, I found a few different teachers. Now, I should also say that I focused mostly on classroom teachers that taught, the 3 R's, for lack of a better term. Not there. It was an industrial school. It also taught blacksmithing and all kinds of farm work. But the teachers that I focus on are mostly women, and some of them. One of them, in fact, went to Carlisle as a student. She got there when she was around 10 years old. She stays. Many of the students, it takes them 8 years if they graduate at all. And then she leaves and she comes back as a teacher after having gone to teacher education school. So, and then she marries somebody at the school and she raises her family at Carlisle. So someone like that has a very particular and different experience than another Native American teacher who went, having gone to another boarding school, Indian boarding school as a child, and she wrote against it and sort of outs Carlisle while she's there. She publicizes. So there are different experiences, and then there are other Native American teachers who teach the arts. So those are a few that I featured, and they were seen as, especially the student who returns and becomes a teacher, she's seen as integral. She's, she ends up working in an office later on, but the school wouldn't function without her. And she's very important to the school. And clearly the school was important to her in some way as well, making that choice to come back. And so.
One of the audience members has a mother who was a Filipino school teacher decades after the era of the Thomasite, so to speak, and says or asks kind of, what about the arrival of the Thomasite teachers kind of after the Spanish had established a Spanish-Filipino education system, that, quote, the Philippines was not a blank slate education-wise. The Spanish and US educational systems had similarities and differences, recognizing it's not what your book is about, but maybe kind of just thinking about that there was already colonialism there.
Right. And so in the Philippines, with the American arrival, there's this sense that the Americans, they're not like the Spanish. There's a lot of talk of, that we are not them, because we're doing this the right way. We're being benevolent. And so there's a lot of talk in policy papers and government documents, and even in some of the teacher personal writings, about the Catholic schools that exist. The way of learning or teaching was rote. You would just repeat what the teacher said, and so there's a criticism of that. There absolutely is a foundation. It was not a blank slate. There were schools when these American teachers arrived. And in fact, some of those buildings were taken over by American teachers, and other places there were new buildings that were created. But there absolutely is a foundation that's built upon, but a real differentiation is made by Americans to say, we're not doing what was being done for the hundreds of years prior to us being here, that the Spanish, put into place.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned, I guess maybe to close in a kind of linear, chronological way, you mentioned the recent commemoration of 100 years of the Thomasites being in the Philippines. I wondered if you could talk about that. Just
Sure. Yes, there was, so at the 2001, there was some kind of celebration, and there was an unveiling of a bust of one of the teachers, a statue that was relayed. And it was largely, as you can imagine, it was a celebration. And we still have this relationship between the United States and the Philippines. Obviously, things between then and now, or between then and 2001, were very different. The Philippines having become independent, etc. Yes, there was a very celebratory event. And in fact, there's a dissertation that came out, it's in the 40s or 50s, where a woman wrote about, she interviewed 50 teachers. And so she has all of these interviews and compiled, and it's a great resource to see. And that largely paints the teaching experience in a very positive light. And people are when you're remembering and telling your own account, you'll tell one story versus another, right? So it's a very positive version of the past. Only certain people answered those questions. But in terms of the celebration in 2001, it was, I think, I wasn't there, I've just read about it, but the pomp and circumstance, I think, was there. It was a way of sort of cementing American relationships continuing, and we're still here. And of course, I just did a book review for a book about the Philippines and US relations, and they were talking about how, even through today, the importance of the Philippines in the Pacific region, and the sort of the shift to the Pacific as foreign relations kind of stuff.
So Christina, I tried to keep to the time frame, although I know we could keep talking. I definitely could keep talking. As a reader of the book, of course, I highly recommend it. On behalf of Rutgers-Newark, which I'm very proud to be able to say those words. It's a remarkable achievement. And as a teacher, I think a massive contribution to looking at the role that educators have played in American and world history in particular. So I thank you for that personally. I guarantee that it will be in our social studies curriculum going forward. I'm sure that there are teachers in the room who will commit to the same. And I look forward to continuing to hear from you and work with you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Congratulations, Elisabeth.
And thank you for all the questions from everybody. If you were able to type in, thank you. Hopefully this won't be my last book talk, but we shall see.
And thanks all of you for these wonderful questions and engagement. If you have missed any of our other events, please follow us on socials at Federated History. And we also have a YouTube channel so that you can watch this in full in case you joined us a little bit later. And please head over to whichever bookstore whichever one you choose. But her book is available. The links have been in the chat. And thank you so Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you so much. And we have a lot of wonderful events coming up next week. So we hope to see you again. Well, we see you until we can reconvene in the fall. Good night, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Safe.
Be safe.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was fantastic. Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank you. Thanks for taking the time and reading it and thinking about it and thinking deeply about it.
Yeah, I really, I'll stay for a minute and talk. It's the first, I can't think of another book about teachers. Teaching, yes. Schools, yes. Education, yes. But I can't think about 5 chapters in a row about the people who did the actual work in the schools. And so for me last night, that was really just powerful to think about. So, yeah.
I mean, I think teaching is one of the most, I mean, there are lots of important jobs, but it's such an important job and it's taken for granted. I mean, this year with COVID, it sort of shows how important the profession is and keeping society going, and raising future generations and that kind of thing. But yeah, I feel like there must be other books about teachers, but not necessarily. A lot of the ones that I found have a little bit about teachers, but talk more about education more broadly.
Right. Yeah. And systems and not the people in them. And those are very different things.
Right.
And I was also really struck by the work that we are doing right now in schools. Black Lives Matter, COVID, undocumented students, economic, recession. We are doing so much that is not teaching curriculum. We are teachers primarily in the classrooms every day, right? In those spaces where the transactions occur a million times a day, building those relationships. And I know that this is true on college campuses also, Christina, and especially at Rutgers-Newark. The work that teachers are doing that is attempting to mediate and alleviate and mitigate the damage that is being done to students in a variety of ways. And I really was just struck by some of those parallels, not that they are the same, but that they are kind of, in some ways, they're very parallel experiences. Teachers can impart trauma to their students. We know that. We work to undo that. We work to make sure it doesn't happen. But our students are experiencing trauma in many ways right now, and teachers not trained at all in a systemic way are encountering that in the classroom, and sometimes not even in physical classrooms. I'm lucky that I'm in a school that is open, but many schools aren't open. So students and teachers are doing that literally this way, which is a whole different conversation. But there's a lot to quote unquote unpack. So Christina, this was I hope a good book talk, since we've never done one before, and now we did.
Yeah,
so it was wonderful. It was absolutely wonderful. I saw Melissa's question was a good question.
Yeah,
I would have liked to.
I was hoping that would maybe be another event. Melissa Cooper asked right at 6:00 about the 3 R's, right? The teachers had charges, actual assignments, those 3 R's, the 4th R, a 4th R being race. And how that kind of worked in those 2 places. And one of the things I think it's interesting to start looking at there is if you look at the pictures of the students at the schools, made white in some ways, made Victorian, made American, made not themselves by these schools and teachers, visually and otherwise. But first and foremost, their clothing when they arrive at Carlisle and the clothing they are quickly made to wear in and of itself as an entire unit in a high school or college classroom.
Right. I know race is everywhere in these stories. It's in the personal writings. It's in the experiences of the students, of the teachers. And I think it is absolutely, it was, I don't know why, I'm a historian, it shouldn't have been as shocking to me,
right.
how explicit it was, but even years into the research, it would still be shocking to me to read it, you know, to read it not just in someone's personal diary sometimes, but also in publications that were sort of celebrating the school, for example.
Right.
And so I think that says so much about who the United States was at the turn of the in this time period. You know, you could say similar things today about who we are today, but yeah, it is quite, and I feel like that is so whitewashed, for lack of a better term, in US history, right? If you don't take a history class beyond 12th grade, you may never get to that kind of understanding. You know, you might get the, you know, that the United States is great narrative, depending on where you go to school. But a lot of people, a lot of Americans seem to be, that's the only narrative that they've ever heard. And I think it's really important to understand like the prevalence of, outside of this book, of the KKK in my local you know, region of New Jersey. People don't know about the history of that. You know, there's so many things like this that need to be unearthed and talked about.
And that goes to the sources and for sure that you have used. And the last comment that has just come up for those people kind enough to stay on with us is curriculum, right? Is how this goes into curriculum, how who we are or who we want to be or who we think we should be gets into curriculum based on who's writing the curriculum and what their intent is. And that who those people are have a tremendous amount of potential power or authority. So that is a whole other thing, right? But we've often talked about curriculum and not talked about teachers, and you talk about both, which is for me so powerful. Okay, Christina Strasburger, I'll stop talking and I'll say thank you. I hope we did okay by you. And I so thank the people who are still here. As always, Rutgers University-Newark is such a place of inquiry and intellect and amazing people in the chat and on Zoom. So thank you.
Thank you all so much. And Elisabeth, congratulations again. I'm sorry it was postponed last year, but this was awesome.
Yay.
We'll see you, we hope, in the
soon.
fall.
Yes. Thank you.
Hope,
So
Elisabeth,
much.
have a great night.
See you soon.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Take care. Thanks.